If you ever looked at the Sphinx and thought that this thing looks old, you are not wrong. But you are also not right in a way you think. Because the Sphinx has a problem. A problem nobody talks about in tourist brochures. The one that has been quietly tearing apart Egyptologists for 30 years. Look at the walls around it. Those vertical channels cutting downwards through the rock. That pattern has a name. It's called precipitation-induced weathering. It's what happens to limestone after centuries of heavy rain. The Sphinx sits in the Sahara Desert. So now we have three questions. What kind of weathering is actually on the Sphinx? When was Egypt last wet enough to cause it? And the question that scares Egyptologists the most? If the answer to the second question is thousands of years before Khafre, then who actually carved the Sphinx? Today we are going to look at four sciences that have spent 30 years staring at the same monument. Archaeology has one answer. Geology has a different one. Climate science has a third. And the inscription that names the Sphinx, they come from a civilization that found the monument already ancient. Four sciences, one stone, no agreement. And when systems don't talk to each other, even the obvious becomes hard to understand. Which is exactly why this video is supported by Odoo. The same problem happens in business every day. Sales is in one tool. Inventory is somewhere else. Accounting is in spreadsheet. Projects are tracked in another app. And suddenly, the business owner is not running a business. They are decoding scattered information. Well, Odoo fixes that. It is an all-in-one ERP platform with 45 easy-to-use apps for CRM, sales, invoicing, accounting, inventory, project management, HR, website, e-commerce, and many more. Everything works inside one connected system. Sales talk to inventory. Inventory talks to accounting. Reports update in real time. So you get fewer blind spots, less manual work, and faster decisions. Your first Odoo app is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. Click the link below because disconnected systems don't just slow you down. They hide the truth. And when we look back at Sphinx, then mainstream Egyptology says the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BCE by a pharaoh named Khafre. That's the date in your textbook. That's the date on every plaque, every documentary, every museum board you have ever read. But a different group of researchers looking at exactly the same monument, they say that Sphinx is older than the last great flood. 12,000 years or maybe more. The gap between those two dates is the entire history of human civilization. So before we ask who's right, let's look at what they are actually disagreeing about. The first witness is not the face, it's the wall. The Sphinx is not standing on the desert like the pyramids. It is standing inside a wound cut into the plateau. The workers cut down into the rock and left the Sphinx standing in the middle of it. A pit. And that pit has walls. And those walls are where the problems start emerging. Because in a desert, stone usually dies slowly. The wind scrapes it from the side. Sand grinds the surface down. Over centuries, edges are softened and the details disappear. But the Sphinx enclosure does not look like that. The walls are cut by deep vertical channels, rounded at the top, running downwards through the limestone, like water had poured over them again and again for a very long time. And this is the first crack in the story. Wind, it doesn't carve downwards like that. Well, rain does. and the Sphinx sits in Sahara. If the textbook is right, these walls should look like a desert monument, but they don't. They look like a memory of a wetter Egypt. And once you see that, the question changes. Because the real clue isn't just that water hit those walls, it's where it hit the hardest. If rain simply fell into the enclosure, the damage should make sense. Because same sky, same storm, and same pit. The walls should suffer together. But they don't. The western wall is heavily eaten away. The eastern wall is barely touched. The damage isn't random, it has direction. That means the water was moving before it entered the pit. Before the pyramids reshaped Giza, the plateau above the Sphinx worked like a giant funnel. Rain hits the high ground, picked up speed, and ran eastward straight into the pit. So the Sphinx wasn't just being rained on, an entire plateau was emptying water into the pit in which the Sphinx was sitting in. And that explains the western wall. But this creates even a bigger problem. Because west of the Sphinx sits Khufu's pyramid complex. And to build it, Khufu's worker cut massive quarries into the plateau. Those quarries changed the surface of Gaza. They broke the old runoff path. After Khufu, water could not move across the plateau the same way. So if the worst damage came from the runoff, it had to start before Khufu's worker ever broke a single piece of ground. Before Khufu. And Khufu actually comes before Khafre. That is the pressure point. The textbook says Khafre carved the Sphinx around 2500 BC. But the rock says the worst damage was already there before Khafre's father was even born. Now the argument is no longer just about rain. It's about the sequence. The wall says water. The direction says runoff. The queries say earlier. But the rock only tells us how the damage happened. For when it happened, we need a different witness. And that's the climate itself. The Sahara was not always a desert. There was a time when North Africa was green. Grasslands spread across regions that are now dry. Lakes filled basins that are now empty. Rivers moved through landscapes where today there is only sand. And this is actually not mythology. This was climate, the green Sahara. Then the monsoon weakened. The rain belt shifted. The land dried. And over time, the Sahara became the desert that we know today. So now the question is simple. Was Giza still wet enough in Khafre's time to carve those channels? That is where the official date starts to strain. Because a few wet seasons don't carve deep vertical scars into limestone. You can't drain a whole plateau into a pit with light rain. For that, you need more than weather. You need time. You need repeated runoffs. You need a wetter world. Climate science does not prove a 12,000-year-old Sphinx by itself. That would become too easy, right? The climate record is messier than that. But it does something dangerous. It puts pressure on the Khafre date. Because the erosion fits an older, wetter Egypt better than it fits the end of the Old Kingdom. So now we have three witnesses. The wall says it was rain. The direction says it was runoff. The climate says it couldn't have happened in Khafre's time. And this is where Egyptology brings out its strongest card. Not the wall, weather, or climate. They bring out a stone sitting between the paws of Sphinx, carved more than 1,000 years too late to be a witness. The stone is between the paws, and it's called the Dream Stele. This is the object the case usually starts with. Because if the walls don't match the textbook, if the rain doesn't match the textbook, if the climate doesn't match the textbook, then maybe this tablet will settle it. Maybe the Egyptians themselves wrote the answer. But this is where the story gets even stranger. Because the tablet does not say that Egypt built the Sphinx. It says Egypt found the Sphinx buried. And that is the part people conveniently skip. By the time Thutmose IV came to Giza, the Sphinx was already under sand. Not fresh, not remembered, but buried. The largest statue of Egypt had disappeared into the desert. Just think about that. This was Egypt. They wrote about kings, gods, wars, offerings, names, prayers, and curses. They carved memory into stone because memory was power, and somehow the Sphinx was lost. This is not a small statue. This is not a broken shrine in a corner of a village. This is the Sphinx, a giant body cut into the ground at Giza. And Egypt had to dig it out. That is what the Dream Stele says. A prince goes for hunting. He gets tired. He sleeps near the Sphinx. And in the dream, the Sphinx speaks. It tells him the sand is choking it. It tells him to clear it and return it. And it promises him throne in return. This is the story on the tablet. Not workers carving stone. Not Khafre building a statue. Not birth of Sphinx. A buried god asking to be uncovered. So before the tablet gives us Khafre, it gives us something even bigger. It gives us forgetting. And that is the problem. Because if Egypt remembered who built the Sphinx, why is the first major story about finding it again? But then comes the line that everybody points to, Khafre. His name appears in the damaged part of the tablet. And yes, that matters. You can't just throw it away. But you also can't stretch it into something that it doesn't say. You don't get a date by using something that the tablet doesn't say, because a name is not a construction record. A damaged line is not a builder's signature. The tablet doesn't say Khafre carved the Sphinx. It doesn't say Khafre made the enclosure. It doesn't say this is when the Sphinx was born. It only tells us that later Egyptians connected Khafre to this place. How? We don't know. And that actually leaves three possibilities. Maybe Khafre built it. Maybe he restored it. Or maybe he claimed something older and pulled it into this world. The tablet doesn't answer any questions. It just opens the wound. Because now Khafre is not gone from the story. He's trapped inside the story. But we don't know what kind of role he's playing. Builder, restorer, owner, or just someone who remembers Sphinx as a god because his pyramids stood beside it. So the stone does not end the debate. It changes the debate. If the tablet can't prove Khafre built the Sphinx, then Egyptology has to prove it from the ground. The pyramid, the causeway, the temple, the blocks, the whole complex around it. So now we leave the stone between the paws and look at the world built around the Sphinx. The Sphinx sits inside Khafre's world. His pyramid, his causeway, his temples, his building project wrapped around it. So the mainstream argument is simple. If the Sphinx is sitting inside Khafre's complex, then Khafre probably built it. And honestly, this is a strong argument. And this is the strongest argument Egyptology has. But there is a problem. Being inside someone's complex does not always mean that it was born there. A king can build around something. King can restore, king can claim, king can take an old sacred object and make it his. Power does not always create sacred things. Sometimes power adopts them. And that is the pressure point. The ground proves Khafre mattered. It proves the Sphinx became part of his original landscape. But it never gives us the sentence we needed that Khafre carved the Sphinx. That sentence does not exist. So now every piece of evidence is saying something different. Wall says water. Climate says older. The tablet says a forgotten story. The ground says Khafre. And that means maybe the problem is not one bad date. Maybe the problem is that we are treating the Sphinx like one clean event. One builder, one moment, one answer. But what if that is the core mistake? Sphinx does not look like one monument. It looks like several. The body tells one story. The head tells another. The enclosure another. The temples another. The tablet another. It looks like a shape shifter. And every age of Egypt seems to have seen a different Sphinx. A lion, a guardian, a sun god, a king's face, a buried relic. It is not only old, it has changed identity. And maybe that is the answer. Maybe Khafre inherited something powerful at Giza. Maybe he gave it a royal face. Maybe later kings forgot the beginning and remembered only the version that they received. We don't know. But the evidence keeps pointing to one idea. The Sphinx may not belong to one moment. It is a monument with layers. So maybe the question was wrong from the beginning itself. Maybe it is not who built the Sphinx. Maybe it is which Sphinx are we talking about? The one that is carved? The one that is claimed by Khafre? The one that is buried in the sand? The one Thutmose heard in their dream? The one Egypt restored again and again? That is the shapeshifter. Not a monster or a magic. A monument that keeps changing meanings while everyone tries to force their own meaning into a date of a monument. And once you see that, the debate becomes smaller. The answer was right. Every answer was incomplete. What do we actually know? We know the official date is not built on one inscription. It is built from a cluster. Khafre's pyramid, his causeway, temple, quarry, the royal landscape around it. That is why Egyptology places the Sphinx in Khafre's time. And that case deserves to be taken seriously. But we also know something else. The walls actually complicate the thing. The water damage is real. The climate question is very much alive. And the tablet doesn't record construction. And the oldest major story about the Sphinx is not about making it. It's about finding it buried. So the honest answer is this: the Sphinx may have entered Khafre's world, but that doesn't prove Khafre created every part of it. And the older Sphinx theory is tempting, but temptations are not proof. But this temptation has a lot of evidence in water, in stone, in climate, in damage. A pyramid complex is the evidence, but none of them are alone enough. And that is why the Sphinx survives. Not because nobody studied it, because every science sees a different face. Archaeology sees Khafre, geology sees water, climate sees an older Egypt forgotten under the dust of Sahara. But the monument itself still sits in silence. Half lion, half king, half memory, half wound. Maybe the Sphinx is not hiding one answer. Maybe it is hiding the fact that how humans like to create their own questions that fit their agenda. This is it from my side today. And don't forget to check out Udu. The link is in the description. This is Harry signing off. Stay curious.